There's a new disease I noticed around. I was reading on the web and I was listening to people talk. I think I'll call it the ought to disease. It's socially transmitted. You know, like you ought to do this or you ought to do that. You know, you ought to get a college education. You ought to wear those clothes. You ought to listen to that music. You ought to have all these things. You ought to pay attention to me. That's the big one. I found that in the last few jobs. There's people, oh, you ought to pay attention to me. You ought to talk with me. You ought to talk about what I want to talk about. You ought to hang out more. You ought to get drunk. Wow, but that wastes money. Why do that? You ought to let me be in charge. That one gets me. You ought to be like us. Actually, to be honest, it's not a new disease. It's an old disease. And they have old names for them, like sexism, racism, socialism, elitism, communism. It just gets disguised for each age. So if you look around and you watch who's getting bullied and who's not fitting in, you'll know what the new ought to disease is. It falls in line with all the other isms. Because, you know, that's what humanity does. So, you know, all you young people ought to look out, because the old people do that to young people. You ought to do this, and sometimes you really ought to, but it's when you don't need to, and they say you ought to, that it becomes a dis-ease. Have a good day.